The first time Hester Wallace walked into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, every head on Main Street turned. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the sharp-boned, sun-weathered way of a woman who had survived things, but because she was tall, taller than most men, and she walked like she owned the earth beneath her boots even when she owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a battered leather satchel that held everything she had left in the world. She had come down from the northern territories on the back of a cattle wagon, sitting in the flat bed among crates of dry goods and a coop of restless chickens, saying nothing for 3 days straight. The drover who had given her the ride told the men at the Caldwell livery that she had not spoken more than 12 words the entire journey, and he said it like it was an accusation, like her silence was a thing she owed him repayment for. She heard him say it. She said nothing then either. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town in the truest and most relentless sense. It sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, just north of the Oklahoma border, and it was the last major stop on the Kishom Trail before the herds crossed into Indian territory. The town breathed cattle. It smelled of cattle. It lived and died by the price of beef in Chicago, and every man who rode into town with trail dust on his coat and money in his pocket was treated like a king for exactly as long as his money lasted. The saloons ran 3 deep on one side of the main street, and the undertaker did steady business without ever having to advertise. Hester was 26 years old, though most people guessed older, because her eyes held a kind of settled grief that usually took decades to accumulate. She stood 5 feet and 10 inches without her boots, which was extraordinary for a woman in that era, and she had the kind of stillness about her that made people uncomfortable. She did not fill silences. She did not laugh at things that were not funny. She did not smile to put others at ease. She simply existed, clearly and completely, in whatever space she occupied, and the people around her never quite knew what to do with that. She found a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Alva Prentice, a broad-chested woman in her 50s who had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 sons, and who assessed Hester at the door with the same unsentimental efficiency she applied to everything. She looked her up and down, noted the quality of her worn coat, the steadiness of her gaze, the absence of any sign of drink or desperation, and said the room was $2 a week, meals included, and if Hester brought men upstairs she would be out by morning. Hester said she understood. Mrs. Prentice handed her a key, and that was that. The job at the dry goods store on 2nd Street came 2 days later. The owner, a Mr. Comstock, a fidgety man who smelled of talcum powder and regret, hired her to keep the books and mind the counter on the days his back gave out, which was most days. She was good with numbers in the quiet, methodical way that comes from having nothing to do in the evenings but think clearly. She did not overcharge. She did not undercount. She kept the ledger in a hand so precise it looked almost mechanical, and within a week Mr. Comstock was telling people he had found the best hire he had ever made, though he said it to other men, not to Hester herself. The people of Caldwell categorized her fast, the way small towns always do. Too tall, too quiet, too strange. The women at the church social decided she was proud, which was the word they used for a woman who did not seek their company. The men at the saloon decided she was cold, which was the word they used for a woman who did not invite their attention. The children who ran past the dry goods store would sometimes stop and stare up at her through the window, the way children stare at things that exist outside the normal order of the world. She bore all of it the way she bore most things, which was with a stillness so complete it looked from the outside like it cost her nothing, though anyone who had ever been truly alone for a long time would have recognized, had they looked closer, exactly what it cost. She had come from a farm in Nebraska that was no longer hers. Her father had died in the winter of 1876, leaving debts she had not known existed, and the bank had taken the land with a cheerful efficiency that still made her chest tight when she thought of it. She had no brothers, no surviving mother, no cousins she could count on. She had sold what she could and moved south and then south again, working where work was available, staying nowhere long enough to feel it was home, which was its own kind of protection. Levi Dawson arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday in early April, 3 weeks after Hester, riding in at the front of a small trail crew that had pushed a herd of 600 longhorns up from southern Texas. He was 29 years old, lean and dark-haired with a jaw that needed shaving and hands so calloused they had stopped cracking in the cold years ago. He was not the loudest man in the crew, which was unusual for a trail boss, and he was not the largest, which sometimes made first impressions difficult. But he had a way of standing that communicated a settled authority, like a man who had already had every argument worth having and come out the other side knowing which ones mattered. He came into the dry goods store on his second day in town because he needed rope, lamp oil, and a new pair of wool socks, which was perhaps the least cinematic list of purchases in the history of romantic encounters. But it is what happened. Hester was at the counter with the ledger open, adding a column of figures, and she did not look up immediately when the door opened, because she was mid-column and she preferred to finish what she was doing. Levi Dawson stood at the counter and waited, which surprised her when she finally looked up, because most men knocked on the wood to get her attention or said something sharp. He was just standing there, easy and unhurried, looking at the row of folded canvas goods on the shelf behind her. She asked what he needed. He told her. His voice was low and even, with the particular dryness of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had the kind of patience that was not passivity but something more deliberate. She pulled the rope, the lamp oil, and found the wool socks in a wooden drawer behind the counter. She set them out and gave him the total. He counted out the coins without making it a performance, and she wrote it in the ledger. He was almost at the door when he stopped. He turned back. He looked at her with a kind of directness that was not rude but was notable in its completeness, like he was actually looking rather than glancing. He said, "You're new here." She said she was. He said his name was Levi Dawson, and that he ran cattle up from Texas most springs and she would probably see him around before the week was out. She told him her name was Hester Wallace. He repeated it, not in the way people sometimes did, where they were checking that they had heard correctly, but in the way a person repeats something they want to remember. Hester Wallace. Just like that, like her name was a thing worth saying properly. She thought nothing of it that afternoon. Or she told herself she thought nothing of it, which was not the same thing. He came back to the store the following day for coffee beans, which she suspected he did not actually need, and the day after that for a paper of pins, which she was quite certain he did not need at all. Each time he came to the counter and waited until she was ready, which she continued to notice and file away in the back of her mind without examining it too closely. On his fourth visit, he did not pretend to need anything. He came in, saw that Mr. Comstock was not present, and said to Hester directly that he wondered if she might like to take a walk along the creek path that evening after the store closed, if she was of a mind to, and that there was no pressure either way, and he would understand completely if she declined. The straightforwardness of it caught her somewhere in the chest. She had been asked to dances and been asked to suppers and been looked at and looked past and talked about in the way she was always talked about. Too tall, too quiet, too strange. But she could not remember the last time someone had simply said what they meant and left the door open without leaning on it. She said she would think about it. He said that was a perfectly reasonable response and left. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon with one part of her mind, while the other part kept the accounts. And by the time she locked the store at 6 o'clock, she had decided she would go, not because she was certain it was wise, but because something in her was tired of certainty as a reason for every decision. The creek path ran behind the row of buildings on the east side of town, winding through a stand of cottonwoods that were just beginning to come into their spring green, the new leaves so pale and translucent in the early evening light that the whole grove looked like it was lit from inside. The creek itself was low after a dry winter, running quiet over flat stones, and the sound of it was one of the more peaceful things Hester had heard in some time. Levi was there before her, leaning against a cottonwood with his hat in his hands, not checking the direction of the road for her but looking at the water. He straightened when he heard her footsteps on the path, and he said good evening with the sort of tone that made it sound like he had actually been looking forward to it. They walked along the path for a while without either of them saying very much, which Hester found unexpectedly comfortable. Most people could not tolerate silence. They stuffed it with words the way you stuffed a draft under a door, and the words were usually about nothing, just noise to fill the gap. Levi Dawson seemed to have no such compulsion. He walked and he looked at the water and the trees and the sky going amber and rose above the plains, and he was simply there, present in the way that some people never quite manage. After a while he asked her where she was from. She told him Nebraska. He nodded and said he had passed through that country once in the fall, and that the sky there was something to see. She agreed that it was. She asked him where he was from, and he said he had been born in Missouri, but that it had been a long time since Missouri felt like anywhere that was his, and that Texas had a better claim on him now, or at least the land between Texas and Kansas did, which was the country he knew best. She asked about the cattle drive, what it was like, the whole length of it from Texas to Kansas. He was quiet for a moment as if deciding how much of the real answer to give, and then he gave the real answer, which was that it was hard and sometimes beautiful and often just relentless, that the work was good because it was clear and physical, and at the end of it, you knew exactly what you had and had not done, that the loneliness of it wore on a person after enough seasons, but that he had not yet found a better way to spend a spring. She listened to all of this with the full attention she gave most things, and he noticed. He said, a little self-deprecatingly, that he had talked more than he usually did and asked if she would like to speak for a while instead. She said she was not much of a talker. He said that was fine, that there was nothing wrong with that, and he meant it in the way that was not politely diplomatic but actually true. She could hear the difference. They walked back to the edge of town as the light dropped to deep blue, and the first stars came clear above the flat horizon of the Kansas plains, and he walked her to the door of Mrs. Prentice's boarding house and took his leave without trying to extend it beyond its natural end. And Hester stood on the porch for a moment after he had gone, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific warmth of having been in the company of someone who had made no attempt to make her into something other than what she was. The trail crew would be in Caldwell for at least another week, waiting for the cattle buyers out of Chicago to finalize their figures. And in that week, Hester and Levi found each other on the creek path twice more, and once in the late afternoon on the steps of the general store when she had just finished work, and he had nothing pressing to attend to. And they sat on the wooden steps in the long western light, and talked about things that started small and got larger as the evening came on. She told him about her father's farm, about the particular way the Nebraska winters came down, about the bank, about the moving south. She said it plainly, without self-pity but without pretending it had been easy, and he listened with the same focused quiet he gave everything, and did not try to fix it or minimize it or tell her things happened for a reason, which she found more comforting than any of those things would have been. He told her about his own history in pieces, not all at once. He had left Missouri at 18 after a falling out with his father over a matter he had come to see differently with time but could not undo. He had hired on with a cattle outfit in Texas and worked his way up through the years from a regular hand to trail boss, which had taken 7 years and a number of difficult lessons. He had no family waiting for him anywhere. He had a small amount of money saved and a vague intention to one day settle on a piece of land somewhere that suited him, though he had not yet found the place. On the 6th evening she asked him, because she was not a woman who avoided direct questions simply because they were uncomfortable, whether he came through Caldwell every spring or only sometimes. He said every spring for the last 4 years, and that he expected the next few years would be the same, as long as the cattle market held. She said she was trying to work out whether she was going to miss him when the crew moved on, and that she thought she probably was, and that she wanted to say that honestly rather than not say it and have him leave without knowing. He was quiet for a moment that was not emptiness but the kind of fullness that gathers before something real is said. He said that he was going to miss her too, and that the walk back through Kansas, and then the long road back to Texas, was going to have a particular kind of weight to it that had not been there on the ride north. She looked at him in the fading light, and he looked at her, and there was in the space between them the honest recognition of something that had been accumulating for days, and that neither of them had the vocabulary to be casual about. He said, "Hester," just her name, the way he had said it that first day in the store, with the same quality of meaning it, of actually saying it rather than just producing the sound, and she felt it land in her chest like a hand pressed flat against a door to hold it open. She said his name back, and it felt like an answer. They did not kiss that evening. They sat in the last of the light, and the conversation moved into quieter, softer territory, and when she finally said good night, she went inside with the feeling that something had begun that she did not yet know the shape of but was already certain she did not want to end. The cattle buyers arrived the next morning, a pair of suited men from a Chicago firm who walked the pens with the brisk efficiency of men who found emotion about animals professionally inconvenient. The deal was struck by noon. The herd changed hands. The money was distributed among the crew, and the mood in Caldwell's saloons that evening was the particular kind of bright and urgent that comes from men who have been on the trail for weeks and have suddenly been given the opportunity to spend. Hester was not at the saloon. She was at Mrs. Prentice's supper table eating fried chicken and listening to Mrs. Prentice's account of the church auxiliary meeting, which had apparently involved a dispute about the decoration of the fellowship hall that had reached a surprising intensity. Hester contributed very little to the conversation, which was her usual practice at supper, but she found she was less present than normal, found her mind drifting down the main street toward the saloons, and then pulling itself back with the brisk self-discipline she had developed over years of not letting herself want things too specifically. He came to the store the following morning early, before Mr. Comstock had arrived, and found her unlocking the door. He said he needed to speak with her if she had a moment. She let him in, and they stood in the early morning light among the shelves of dry goods and the smell of coffee beans and sawdust. He said the crew was pulling out the following day to begin the ride back to Texas. He said he had been thinking all night, and he did not want to be the kind of man who rode away from something real without at least saying that it was real. He said he had no proper way to offer her anything at this point, that he was a trail boss with savings and no land and no permanence yet, and he understood if none of that was something she wanted to invest any hope in, but that he was not willing to leave without telling her that the time he had spent with her in the last week was the most alive he had felt in a very long time, and that there was something between them that he did not think either of them should just let ride off into the distance without acknowledging. She stood across the counter from him in the morning light, this tall, quiet woman who had been called strange for standing still inside herself, and she looked at him with eyes that gave him the full truth of what she was thinking, which was that she felt the same way and that she was afraid of it in the way she was afraid of everything she genuinely wanted, which was precisely and specifically and not at all generally. She said, "When you come back in the spring, Levi, I want you to come back with a real intention. Not a hope and not a question. If there is something here worth building, then I want to build it. I am not made for in-between." He held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is agreeing to something that changes the direction of things. He said, "That is exactly what I needed to hear." He left the following morning with his crew, south along the cattle trail, and Hester watched from the doorway of the dry goods store until the dust of their horses settled and the street was quiet again. Then she went inside and opened the ledger and found the column of figures where she had left off the day before, and she added them up slowly and carefully, which took longer than usual because her mind kept drifting south. The summer in Caldwell was hot and relentless, the way Kansas summers were, with a heat that pressed down from a white sky and shimmered off the packed dirt of the streets, and made the creek run even lower, until by August it was barely a trickle between the flat stones. Hester worked the counter and the ledger and walked the creek path in the evenings, though there was less reason to now, and she read in her room at Mrs. Prentice's by the light of her oil lamp until the nights grew too warm for it. She received a letter from him in July. It had taken 3 weeks to arrive, making its way through a chain of postal riders and frontier offices, and it was written in a hand that was clear and deliberate without being elegant, which suited him exactly. He wrote about Texas in the summer, about the land and the cattle and the work of preparing for the next drive. He wrote about something funny that had happened with one of the younger hands and a very determined armadillo. He did not write flowery sentences or dramatic declarations. He wrote the way he talked, which was plainly and actually, and at the end of the letter, in the same even hand as the rest of it, he wrote that he thought about her more than he had expected to, and that he intended to come back in the spring with a real intention, exactly as she had asked, and that he meant it. She read the letter 3 times that evening and then put it in the pocket of her leather satchel, carefully, folded to the proper size. She wrote back the following day, 2 pages in her own precise hand, about the store and Mrs. Prentice and the summer heat, and the way the prairie looked in July when the grass had gone golden, and the sky was so big and so blue it made everything under it feel simultaneously small and completely important. She wrote that she was glad the letter had come. She wrote that she was going to hold him to what he said about intentions. She signed it with her full name, Hester Wallace, which felt right. His reply came in August, and through the fall there was a letter each month, regular as the seasons, their correspondence building the careful architecture of 2 people trying to know each other across distance. The winter was the hard part. The letters slowed in January and February when the mail riders struggled with the cold and the mud, and sometimes weeks passed without word, and during those weeks Hester did what she had always done with difficulty, which was move forward through it steadily, without letting herself stop. She spent Christmas at Mrs. Prentice's table with 2 other boarders, a quiet schoolteacher named Miss Clara Horn, and an older land surveyor named Mr. Boggs, who was too deaf to follow most of the conversation but seemed to enjoy the company. Mrs. Prentice made a proper Christmas dinner with a turkey that had cost her significantly, and a dried apple pie that was the best thing Hester had eaten in months. And they sat at the table for 2 hours in the warm lamplight, and it was, Hester thought, the closest thing to family she had had in several years. She thought of Levi Dawson in his Texas bunkhouse, or wherever he spent his winters, and she thought of the letter she had written in November that she hoped had reached him before the holiday, and she thought that there was something both precarious and sustaining about the space between them, about the way they were building something out of words on paper, and the memory of evenings along a creek path in a Kansas spring. February brought a different kind of trouble. Mr. Comstock's health declined sharply, a matter of his heart, the doctor said, and his wife insisted he rest completely through the winter and spring. He asked Hester if she would take on the full management of the store until he was well enough to return, handling the suppliers and the accounts and all the daily running of it, and offered her a larger salary to do so, enough that she could begin saving in a way she had not been able to before. She agreed, because it was the right thing, and because the work suited her, and because having more to do was, in the deep winter, a grace rather than a burden. She managed the store with the same thoroughness she gave everything. She negotiated with the supply man from Wichita for better prices on coffee and flour, and she rearranged the shelving to make better use of the space, and she kept the books in the kind of meticulous order that made Mr. Comstock, when he visited once in March wrapped in a heavy coat with his wife beside him, go quiet with something that looked very much like gratitude. The spring came back to Kansas the way it always did, sudden and certain, the prairie greening up seemingly overnight and the air going from the tight cold of winter to a wide, living warmth that smelled of new grass and wet earth. The cattle trails began to stir. Word reached Caldwell through the ranchers and drovers who came in for supplies that the herds were moving north again. Hester found herself watching the southern road with a discipline she was mostly successful at maintaining, which was to look only as much as was natural, and to continue doing what she was doing, and to not let herself become a woman standing at a window waiting, because she had promised herself some years ago that she would never be that woman. He arrived on a Thursday in April, almost exactly a year from when she had first seen him, though she had not marked the date and neither had he, or if he had neither of them said so. He came into the store at mid-morning, the door swinging open on the warm April air, and he stood there in trail dust with his hat in his hand, and he looked at her across the counter with an expression that was plain and clear and very sure. He said, "I told you I would come back with an intention." She was already moving around the counter, not running, just walking quickly and directly toward the thing she had made up her mind about months ago, and when she reached him she looked up at him, which was the particular strangeness of her life that she had to look up at this one man, because he had an inch on her at least, and he looked down at her with that steady dark gaze. He reached up and put one calloused hand against the side of her face, and she felt the roughness of it and the warmth of it against her jaw, and he said, quietly and completely, "Hester." Just her name, the way he had always said it like it was worth saying. She put her hands against his chest and felt the dust of the trail under her palms, and she said, "You took long enough." He laughed, a low, real sound, and then he kissed her, there in the dry goods store in the morning light among the shelves of flour and rope and lamp oil. And it was not a tentative or exploratory kiss, but a certain one, the kind that arrives already knowing what it is. They talked for 2 hours that day, sitting on stools behind the counter with the store technically open, and Mr. Comstock's cat sleeping on a bolt of canvas near the door. Levi said he had spent the winter thinking about what he wanted, and he had arrived at some conclusions that he wanted to share plainly, because that was the only way he knew how to do things. He said he had saved enough to make a down payment on a piece of land. Not much, 160 acres south of Caldwell, land he had looked at the previous fall with an eye to what it could become. He said it would take work and time and likely some difficult years before it was properly a place, but that he believed in the land and he believed in the work, and he was asking her, not to make any decision today, but to think about whether the life he was describing was one she could see herself inside of. He said, and he was careful here, with a kind of earnestness that she found both touching and slightly funny in the best possible way, that he was not just asking for a housekeeper or a partner in work, that he was asking because she was the most herself person he had ever met, and that being around her made him more himself in return, and that he thought that was the thing people were actually looking for when they were looking for someone, even if they did not always name it that way. Hester was quiet for a long moment. The cat shifted on the canvas. Outside, someone drove a wagon past on the street, and the sound of the wheels on the packed dirt came through the wooden walls. She said, "I have been thinking about it since the fall, Levi. I just needed to know you had thought about it too, and that it was a real question." He said it was the realest question he had ever asked anyone. She said yes. The engagement was not a long one. There was no reason to make it long, because both of them were past the age of needing time to decide, and because the practical realities of homesteading made the sooner the better. They married 6 weeks later, in June of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was the closest available building with a minister, neither of them being particularly devout, but both of them understanding the social weight of doing things properly in a frontier town. Mrs. Prentice cried, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Prentice, who recovered quickly and covered it by going very brisk and efficient about the business of the reception, which was held in her parlor and featured a cake she had spent 2 days on and did not want discussed. Miss Clara Horn, the schoolteacher, came, and Mr. Comstock came in his heavy coat, though it was June and his heart was not yet fully reliable, and several of Levi's trail crew came cleaned up and unrecognizable in fresh shirts. There were 12 people in the room, and it was the exactly right number. Hester wore a dress that was not white because she was a practical woman, and a white dress in the middle of a working day in a working town seemed to her an expensive inconvenience. But it was a deep green that was the best color she had ever put on her body, and the tallness that people had commented on her whole life looked, in that dress in that light, like exactly what it was, which was simply how she was made. She stood beside Levi Dawson in front of the minister, and listened to the words and meant them with the particular completeness of a person who does not say things they do not mean. And when he took her hand, she felt the roughness of his palm against hers and looked sideways at him, and found him already looking at her, with that clear dark gaze that had always been the most honest thing in whatever room it was in. The minister said the part about "do you take," and Levi said "I do" with a voice that was quiet and entirely certain, and she said "I do" with a voice that was quieter still but just as certain, and they were married in the early summer light in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1879. The land Levi had chosen was 14 miles south of Caldwell on the eastern edge of a broad, shallow valley that caught the morning light in a way that made the grass look like it had been painted. There was a creek, small but reliable, running along the eastern boundary, and a stand of cottonwoods along its bank that provided shade in the August heat, and the particular music of leaves in a wind that Hester had loved since she was a child on the Nebraska farm. The existing structure on the property was a single-room soddy that was dry and sound, but essentially a square box, which Levi had spent 2 weeks before the wedding making as habitable as he could, adding a wooden floor and a cast-iron stove and shelving along one wall. It was small and it smelled of earth, and it was theirs, which transformed it considerably. They moved the first load of their few belongings out to the homestead on the afternoon after the wedding, driving a borrowed wagon with 2 chairs, a trunk, a crate of kitchen goods, a bag of seed grain, and the battered leather satchel that had been with Hester since Nebraska. Levi drove and Hester sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the June prairie opened out around them, wide and golden green and very quiet, and she breathed it in and felt something in her settle that had not been settled for a very long time. The homesteading was harder than the description of it. The first summer was a matter of establishing the basics, the kitchen garden, the small corral, the beginnings of a proper vegetable store for the winter, and learning the specific personality of that piece of land, where it was generous and where it was difficult, what the creek did in a heavy rain, where the soil was good and where it was caliche hardpan. Levi went into Caldwell twice a week for supplies and to check in with the men he had hired to manage the last of his trail business, which he was winding down over the course of the year as the homestead demanded more of him. Hester kept the accounts for the homestead with the same precision she had kept Mr. Comstock's ledger, and she tended the garden and learned to do the things that needed doing on a working piece of land. And she was not afraid of the work, though there were days in August when the heat was so complete, and the sky was so white, and the distances were so enormous that she felt the old loneliness come back, the particular hollow quality of living somewhere that did not yet fully recognize her. But there were other days. There were the mornings when the light came over the valley rim in long gold bars, and the creek caught it and threw it back in fragments, and Levi would come in from the early chores, and they would have their coffee at the small table by the window and not say much, because they still had that, the capacity for a quiet morning together that neither of them needed to fill, and she would feel in those mornings a fullness that was the absolute opposite of the hollow. There was the evening in September when a storm came down from the north faster than expected, and they got the chickens in, and the shutters closed just as the rain hit. And then they sat inside the soddy and listened to it hammer down and the wind shake the roof. And Levi told her about the worst storm he had ever been in on the trail. 3 days of rain in Oklahoma territory. The cattle wild and the creek risen, and the mud like something alive trying to swallow everything. And she laughed at his telling of it because he had a dry way of describing disaster that was funnier than it should have been. And the storm raged outside, and the oil lamp made a warm circle in the small room. And she thought, this is it. This is what I moved south from Nebraska for, and then south again, and then here. This room with this man in this storm. There was a harder season coming, though neither of them knew it yet. In November of 1879, a man named Cass Hollowell arrived in Caldwell claiming ownership of a strip of land along the eastern edge of the property Levi had purchased, a narrow but significant corridor that included, crucially, the stretch of creek that ran along the boundary. Hollowell was a land speculator, which was a profession that flourished in the frontier territories in the late 1870s like a particular kind of weed. Men who bought up disputed claims and old Mexican land grants, and relied on the complexity and inconsistency of frontier land records to press claims of questionable legitimacy. He had a document that looked official from a distance, and was revealed on closer examination to be a transfer of deed from an earlier claim that had been superseded by the Homestead Act filing Levi had completed in the proper fashion through the Wichita Land Office. The problem was not the law, which was on Levi's side, but the time and expense of proving it through the frontier court system, which moved with the speed and reliability of a wagon with 3 wheels. Hollowell came to the homestead on a cold Tuesday morning with a man Hester privately thought of as his shadow, a thin, pale man who said nothing, and held a sheaf of papers and watched everything carefully. Hollowell himself was a broad, red-faced man of perhaps 50, well-dressed in the manner of someone who wanted to look wealthy rather than someone who was, and he spoke with the particular confidence of a man who had done this many times and found the intimidation of settlers to be straightforward and usually effective. He addressed himself entirely to Levi and looked past Hester as if she were furniture, which was something Hester noted with a cold precision and put away in the back of her mind for use later. Levi listened to Hollowell's claim with an expression that gave nothing away, which was its own kind of answer to people who thought they could read him. He said he would look into the matter and be in touch through the proper legal channels. When Hollowell and his shadow had gone, Hester stood in the doorway watching the wagon roll up the track and then turned to Levi and said they needed to go to the land office in Wichita as soon as possible, and that she wanted to go with him, and that she had some thoughts about the documents if he would like to hear them. He said he would very much like to hear them. She laid out on the table what she knew about land records and the Homestead Act from having managed Mr. Comstock's store accounts, which had put her in contact with enough frontier legal documents to give her a working knowledge of how they were structured. She had already noted 2 inconsistencies in Hollowell's claim document, and she suspected that a proper examination of the original filing records in Wichita would reveal others. Levi watched her work through it across the table with a look on his face that was not surprise, because he had never been surprised by her competence, but something more like deep satisfaction, the expression of a man who had made a choice and found it not just validated but exceeded. They went to Wichita 3 days later, leaving the homestead in the care of a neighboring family named the Birdsongs, who were established on the next property and had been good neighbors since midsummer. The Birdsongs were a practical family, a husband and wife and their adult son, who had come up from Missouri 2 years earlier and built a solid operation, and who loaned tools and labor in the way that frontier neighbors understood was not charity, but the mutual practicality of survival. The land office in Wichita was housed in a long, low building on the edge of town that smelled of paper and ink, and the particular anxiety of people fighting over Earth. The clerk there, a harried man named Mr. Finks, found Levi's original filing with relative efficiency and laid it beside Hollowell's document on the counter, and Hester looked at both of them with her ledger-keeper's eye and found what she had suspected. Hollowell's deed claimed provenance from a transfer dated 1871, but the survey markers it referenced used a notation system that had not been adopted in that county until 1874, which made the document either a forgery or a backdated alteration, neither of which was legal. She pointed this out to Mr. Finks in a quiet, even voice, and Mr. Finks looked at the document for a long moment, and then looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this particular kind of trouble from this particular direction, and said he would need to refer the matter to the district land commissioner. The commissioner's office was 2 buildings down. They went there the same day, and by 4 in the afternoon they had a written statement from the commissioner's office confirming that Hollowell's claim was being reviewed on grounds of potential document irregularity, and that no action against Levi's homestead claim could proceed until the review was completed. They drove back to the homestead in the cold November dusk, and Hester felt the satisfaction of it, not triumph, which she did not trust, but the quieter satisfaction of having applied careful thought to a difficult problem and found the place where the structure was weak. Levi drove and she sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the prairie was brown and still in the November evening, the sky that deep cold blue that preceded the real winter. He said, "You saw that in the document the same day he came out here, didn't you?" She said she had noticed it, yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Hester Wallace, you are the most remarkable person I have ever known." She said, "Dawson, now." He glanced sideways at her, and in the fading light his face had the open quality it had when he was genuinely moved rather than just saying words. He said, "Hester Dawson, you are the most remarkable person I have ever known." She said she was just paying attention, which was all she had ever done. He said that was the thing, that most people did not do it, and that she did it consistently and completely, and that it made an enormous difference in the practical quality of a shared life, and also that he was in love with her in a way that kept getting larger rather than settling into something manageable, and he thought she ought to know that. She looked out at the prairie going dark and felt the warmth of it in her chest, the specific warmth of being known by someone who had looked at you carefully and not flinched. She said, "I know, I feel the same way. It does keep getting larger." He put his free hand over hers on the wagon seat and they drove home through the dark. Hollowell's claim was dismissed by the land commissioner in January. The document confirmed to be fraudulent, a backdated alteration prepared by a disgraced former county surveyor who had apparently worked with Hollowell on 3 previous similar attempts in the region. Hollowell himself faced a legal inquiry. Though the frontier justice system being what it was in 1880, the inquiry proceeded slowly and arrived at a conclusion that was less severe than it might have been. He left the Caldwell area the following spring, apparently having found other territories more profitable for his particular skills, and was not heard from in that county again. The homestead survived the winter, and the winter, as it turned out, was the making of it in certain ways. The months of cold and indoor closeness gave them the time to learn each other in the deep detail that the busy seasons did not, the small habits and preferences and tolerances of 2 people sharing a small space, and they found, with some genuine relief, that they were compatible in the ways that mattered and interestingly different in the ways that kept things alive. Hester read in the evenings, sometimes for hours, going through whatever she could get from the Caldwell lending library, which was not extensive but was earnestly maintained by the librarian, a former schoolteacher named Mrs. Galt, who ordered new books from the East with a persistence that bordered on the heroic. Levi carved wood in the evenings, a skill he had picked up on the trail from a Mexican hand named Santos who had taught him the basics one winter in Texas, And he was not a great artist, but he was a careful and patient one. And the shelves of the soddy gradually acquired small carved objects, a horse, a bird, an approximation of a cottonwood tree. He made her a small carving of a woman, tall and straight-backed, which he left on the table one morning without comment. She picked it up and turned it in her hands and looked at the clean carved lines of it and put it on the shelf above the window where the morning light would find it. She never said anything about it directly. She did not have to. The spring of 1880 was the first season in which the homestead began to look less like an effort and more like a place. The garden was twice the size of the previous years, with better beds and proper furrows and a root cellar Levi, and the birdsong son had dug in the fall and lined with stone. The small herd of cattle, 15 head purchased with the last of Levi's trail savings, had come through the winter in good health and added 3 calves by April. The soddy had acquired a lean-to addition on the eastern side that served as a combined pantry and workroom, and made the main living space feel, by comparison, practically spacious. Levi had completely stopped taking trail contracts by then, his attention and energy fully given to the homestead. He missed the trail sometimes, he said honestly when she asked, in the way you could miss a version of yourself that was simpler and needed less. But he did not regret the exchange, and she believed him. In April of 1880, on an afternoon when the prairie was in its first green, and the sky was that enormous blowing blue of a spring Kansas day, Hester told Levi that she was going to have a child. He was at the corral, checking the fence line, and she had walked out from the house in the afternoon wind to tell him, because it was not the kind of information that waited for a proper moment. He turned from the fence and looked at her, and his face did something complicated and unguarded in the afternoon light, something that moved through surprise and then a kind of awe and then landed on a happiness so straightforward and uncomplicated that she felt her own throat tighten. He came to her across the corral yard and took both her hands in his and said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, which was simply, "Are you well? Are you happy about it?" Not congratulations, not declarations, just the most direct possible inquiry into her actual experience, which was, she thought, the most loving question anyone had ever asked her. She said she was well and that she was, yes, very happy about it, and that she thought they should write to Mrs. Prentice because she would want to know. He laughed, the real low laugh, and pulled her to him and held her in the spring afternoon with the wind moving through the cottonwoods by the creek, and she put her face against his neck and felt the warmth of him and the absolute stillness at the center of this life she had built. The summer of 1880 was dry, which was difficult for the garden, and Hester was more tired than she was used to being, which she found mildly annoying and tried to treat as a practical matter to be managed rather than a condition to be fussed over. She kept the homestead accounts and wrote her letters and read in the evenings and walked the creek path in the long summer evenings with Levi, slower now as the summer progressed, but still moving, still present. Mrs. Prentice came out from Caldwell in July to check on her, driving herself in a rented buggy with an authority that required no explanation, and she inspected the soddy and the garden and Hester's general condition, and declared everything satisfactory in a tone that made it sound like this was not a foregone conclusion. She stayed for supper and told them about Caldwell, about Miss Clara Horn, the schoolteacher who had married the new land surveyor in a quiet ceremony in May, about Mr. Comstock's continued recovery and his wife's determined management of it, about the new freight office that had opened on 2nd Street and the ongoing civic debate, about whether the town needed a second church or could manage with improvements to the first. She left in the early evening with her characteristic efficiency, and Hester stood on the porch and watched her go and felt again that warmth of being someone's concern, of being in someone's world in the way that mattered. In September of 1880, their son was born. The labor was long, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Hartley, who came out from Caldwell, was steady and practical throughout it, and Levi sat outside the soddy's door through most of the night with his back against the sod wall and his hat on his knee, and did not pretend to be anything other than a man who was very afraid and very hopeful in equal measure. When Mrs. Hartley came out and told him everything was well and that he had a son, he stood up from the ground and went inside and stood in the lamplight looking at Hester, who was exhausted in the absolute bone-deep way of a person who has been through something enormous, and at the small person she held, and he looked at them both for a long moment without speaking. Then he went and sat on the edge of the bed and took her free hand and brought it to his mouth and held it there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her knuckles and looked at him over the top of the baby's small head and thought that there was no word large enough for what this was. They named the boy Samuel, after no particular person, but because they both liked the weight and plainness of it. Samuel Dawson. He was a good-natured infant, serious and watchful in the way his mother was, and he had Levi's dark hair and Hester's precise, considering eyes, and in the first weeks of his life he was passed between neighbors and visitors and Mrs. Prentice with the calm tolerance of a child who has entered the world knowing he is wanted. The years on the homestead built themselves layer by layer. The soddy was expanded and then eventually replaced, in 1882, with a proper timber frame house, 2 bedrooms and a front room, and a real kitchen with a window above the workbench that looked east toward the creek, which was the view Hester had wanted since the first year. Levi built most of it himself with help from the birdsong son and 2 other neighboring men, and Hester helped in the ways she could, which were more than people expected, and the house went up over a long summer and was standing, solid and plain and genuinely theirs, before the first fall cold came in. The cattle herd grew slowly and deliberately, because Levi was not a man who expanded faster than he could manage well, and by 1883 they had 60 head, enough to make the operation viable and to bring in a hired hand 2 days a week, a young man of 18 named Tobias who was serious about the work, and who had come west from Ohio with a family that had not survived the journey as a complete unit, his father having died of fever in Missouri. Leaving Tobias and his mother and sister to manage, as best they could on the claim the family had filed 12 miles north. Levi treated the boy with the same matter-of-fact dignity he brought to everything, paying him fairly and teaching him what he knew, and Hester gave him dinner on his working days and sometimes sent him home with extra provisions in the off-handed way she had that was not charity but was unmistakably generous. She managed the homestead accounts with the precision she had always brought to numbers, and over the years the margins improved as she found efficiencies, and as the cattle prices held, and as the garden became reliable enough to both feed them and provide surplus for sale at the Caldwell market on Saturdays. She had, quietly and without making a particular statement of it, become the kind of woman who was central to the functioning of a working property in ways that extended well beyond the domestic. Though in 1882 on the Kansas frontier this was not unusual, the reality of homestead life requiring both partners to bring everything they had. What was unusual, what Caldwell and the surrounding area had to reckon with over the years, was the quality of her presence and the consistency of it. The woman they had called too tall and too quiet and too strange in that first year gradually, without effort or performance on her part, became the woman you asked when you had a complicated problem with your accounts or a dispute about a land boundary or a garden that was not producing as it should, because she would look at the thing with her full attention and tell you what she actually saw, not what she thought you wanted to hear. She was not a social woman in the conventional sense. She still did not fill silences for the comfort of others. She still did not laugh at things that were not funny. She still stood exactly as tall as she was, and moved through the world with the unhurried directness that had been mistaken for strangeness by people who had confused strangeness with the simple refusal to pretend. But the people who knew her, The Mrs. Prentices and the Bird Songs and the Tobias Langdons and the Clara Horns and the Mr. Comstocks, they knew what she was, which was a person of complete and reliable integrity, and that was a rare enough thing in any era that it commanded its own quiet authority. In the fall of 1883, she had their second child, a girl they named Eleanor, dark-eyed and loud in the determined way of a second child, who has observed from her arrival that the world contains other people whose claims on attention must be contended with. Eleanor was from her earliest months a child of decided opinions, which she expressed with increasing eloquence as she aged, and Hester found this quality alternately exhausting and deeply funny, because she recognized it as something that had been in her own nature since childhood and that had been systematically discouraged by everyone around her until she had grown old enough to stop caring. She told Levi once, watching Eleanor at age 2 conduct a furious and remarkably coherent argument with an uncooperative chicken, that she thought Eleanor was going to have a much easier time of it than she herself had had, because she, Hester, had been shaped largely by silence and isolation, whereas Eleanor was apparently going to be shaped by the secure conviction that she had the right to say what she thought, which was the more useful foundation. Levi said he thought that was quite possibly true, and that it was her mother who had given her that foundation, and that the world would be better for it. She looked at him across the yard in the fall afternoon and felt, as she did with some regularity, the particular depth of her gratitude for this man, not the surface gratitude of relief or rescue, but the deeper thing, the recognition that he had seen her and named her and made a space in which she could be fully herself, which was the most extraordinary gift one person could give another, and which she was not sure she had ever fully said out loud. That evening after the children were asleep, she said it, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the fall wind outside, and the house warm and solid around them. She said that she wanted him to know what it had been to be seen by him from the beginning, to have him say her name like it was a thing worth saying when the rest of the world had spent years deciding what to call her instead of just calling her by her name and meaning it. He put down the piece of wood he had been carving and looked at her across the table with that clear, dark gaze, and he said that she had been the most straightforward choice he had ever made, and that she had asked him to come back with a real intention, and he had, and that in everything that followed he had never once doubted the intention, only, sometimes, his own ability to deserve it. She said she had been working on deserving it from her end too, and that she thought it was probably the kind of thing that worked better when both people kept working on it rather than declaring it settled. He said he thought she was right about that, which was not unusual. She laughed, and it was the full, real laugh, the one that she did not produce for social purposes, but only when something was actually funny, and he smiled at the sound of it the way he always did, the particular smile that was just for that, and the lamplight held them both in its warm circle while the Kansas night pressed against the windows. Samuel grew into a boy who loved the land with a physical, instinctive passion that made the homesteading life feel designed for him. By the age of 6, he was following Levi around the property with the focused attention of a person learning by absorption, and by 8, he understood the rhythms of the cattle and the garden and the creek better than many adults who had been working land for decades. He had his mother's quietness and his father's patience, and the combination made him, in the assessment of the Birdsong family and old Tobias Langdon and Mrs. Prentice on her visits, a remarkably pleasant child to be around. Eleanor was the counterpoint, loud where Samuel was quiet, impatient where he was methodical, already at 4 demonstrating the kind of stubborn intelligence that would either serve her extraordinarily well or make life continuously interesting, and probably both. She had her mother's height, coming in, even at 4, notably taller than the other children her age, which Hester noticed with a complicated feeling that was part amusement and part protectiveness, remembering what too tall had cost her, and resolved to ensure that Eleanor carried her height differently, as a simple fact of her body and not a judgment upon her character. In the spring of 1885, Levi Dawson did something that Hester did not know about until it was done, which was that he rode into Caldwell on a Wednesday and commissioned from the silversmith, an old German craftsman named Mr. Kruger who had set up shop on 2nd Street in 1881, a piece of jewelry. Not a practical thing, not a brooch for a dress or a plain ring of the kind common in the territories, but something he had thought about for a long time and described to Mr. Kruger in some detail, a pendant on a fine chain, a small piece worked in silver and turquoise, the turquoise coming from a trader who passed through the area twice a year from New Mexico, and the design on it was simple, just the clean curve of a cottonwood tree in early leaf, because cottonwoods along a creek in spring was a thing that belonged to both of them in a way nothing else quite did. He gave it to her on an evening in May when the cottonwoods by the creek were in their early leaf, that pale translucent green that made the whole grove glow, and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and the prairie evening was one of those that Kansas produced occasionally as if to make a case for itself, wide and golden and smelling of new grass. He put it on the kitchen table between them without preamble, just a small wrapped thing in brown paper, and said that it was not any particular occasion, he just wanted her to have it. She unwrapped it and held it in the lamplight and looked at the silver cottonwood and felt something move through her chest that was beyond articulation, because it was not just the thing itself, though the thing itself was beautiful, but what it said, which was that he had been watching and remembering and attending to the small specific details of what was theirs, and that after 6 years of building a life together, he was still doing that. Still paying the kind of attention that had been rare and startling to her when she first encountered it and was, she now understood, simply who he was. She held the pendant in her hand for a long moment and then looked up at him and said, "How do you still find ways to say things that matter when you could just stop saying them?" He said he thought about that sometimes, about why some people stopped and others did not. And his conclusion was that the people who stopped had decided that the work was done, that they had secured what they were after and could ease off, and that he had never thought of it that way, not with her, not with this, because it did not feel like secured to him, it felt like ongoing and he was glad for it. She said she was too. She put the pendant around her neck and it lay against the base of her throat, warm from her hand, and she wore it most days from then on, in the way you wear something that is not a decoration but a statement. And when the children asked about it, she told them it was from their father and it was a cottonwood tree, and Alina wanted one immediately, which was entirely consistent with Alina, and Samuel looked at it for a long moment and then looked at his father and nodded, which was entirely consistent with Samuel. The summer of 1885 brought a drought that tested every homestead in that part of Kansas. The creek dropped in July and was nearly gone by August, and the kitchen garden struggled despite everything Hester could do for it, and the cattle moved further for water and required constant management. Levi worked from before dawn until after dark through the worst of it, and Hester worked alongside him in the ways that were most useful, managing the household food stores with the mathematical precision of a quartermaster to ensure that what they had would last through the dry weeks, negotiating with the birdsongs to share their deeper well for the cattle, planning what could be replanted in the fall when the rain came back. It was hard and it was tiring, and there were evenings when both of them sat at the kitchen table with the children in bed, and neither had much to say. Just the shared exhaustion of people who had given everything the day required. But even in those evenings there was something, the way his hand found hers across the table without his looking, the way she set his coffee down where he could reach it without interrupting whatever he was thinking about, the small continuous evidence of a life so interwoven that the threads could no longer be separated. The rain came back in September. A long, steady, soaking rain that fell for 3 days and refilled the creek and brought the pasture back to green, and ran into the root cellar through a drainage issue they had not known existed, filling it with 2 inches of water and ruining approximately 1/3 of the winter vegetable store, which was a genuine problem but was also, in the specific exhausted relief of the rain's return, somewhat funny. And Hester stood in the root cellar in her boots in 2 inches of cold, muddy water surveying the damage and started laughing, a full-throated, completely genuine laugh. And Levi, standing on the steps behind her, looked down at the water and then at his wife and started laughing too, and they stood there in the flooded root cellar in the September rain laughing, until it became the kind of laughter that is indistinguishable from relief. They rebuilt the vegetable store. The drought year set them back financially but did not break them, because they had been careful, and because the cattle came through in better shape than many of the neighboring herds, and by the spring of 1886 they were on solid ground again. Tobias Langdon, who was 24 now and had been working the homestead 3 days a week for 3 years, had managed to accumulate enough saved wages, with Levi's help in negotiating the purchase, to make a claim on 30 acres of his own adjacent to his mother's land, which was the occasion for a genuine celebration at the Dawson homestead, a proper supper with the Birdsong family and Mrs. Hartley the midwife and old Mr. Comstock, who was frail now but still attended things that mattered, and Tobias sat at the head of the table that Levi had built and looked around the room with the expression of someone who had been through enough to understand what good fortune felt like when it arrived. Hester made a pie for that supper, a dried apple pie from the recipe she had learned from Mrs. Prentice, and it was the best she had ever made it, and Tobias said so, and she was quietly pleased in the way she was quietly pleased by things done well, which was one of her favorite feelings. Mrs. Prentice came for Christmas every year now, a ritual that had been established without anyone formally establishing it, and she had taken to bringing Miss Clara Horn, now Mrs. Clara Garner, and Clara's husband, the land surveyor, whose name was David, and who had the dry, precise humor of a man who spent most of his life measuring things, and had developed a philosophical acceptance of the imprecision of everything else. The Christmas of 1886 was the largest gathering the house had held, 12 people at the extended table, and Hester looked down the length of it at the faces, the children, the neighbors, the old friends, Levi at the far end talking with Mr. Birdsong about something that involved gestures suggesting significant distances, and she had the complete, quiet moment of understanding her own life, understanding that she had built this, not by herself, but with this man and these people, that she had come into Caldwell in the spring of 1878 with nothing but her height and her silence and her strange, complete selfhood, and she had been called too tall and too quiet and too strange. And she had been given her name by one person who said it like it meant something, and here, in this room, in this December light, was what it had come to mean. She picked up her coffee cup and looked down the table at her husband, and he looked up from his conversation at precisely that moment, because he had always had an awareness of her that operated on its own frequency, and he held her gaze across the room full of people and food and lamplight, and the sound of children and conversation, and there was between them the particular communication of people who have learned each other over years. Complete and unhurried and entirely private in the middle of the crowd. She raised her cup slightly, just a fraction, and he understood it the way he understood most things about her, which was immediately and correctly, and he raised his own cup in return, and they drank across the length of the table in the December light. In the spring of 1887, Hester discovered she was carrying their third child. She was 35 years old by then, and the news came with a different quality than it had the previous times, not less welcome but more weighted, because she was old enough to know both what it was and what it cost. She told Levi in the morning, in the kitchen, over the ordinary business of the early day, in the same direct way she had always told him things, and he listened, and then sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee, and was quiet for a moment that was not worry exactly, but the careful attention of a man taking something in. He asked if she was well, and if she was glad about it, and she said she was cautiously well, and that she thought glad was the right word, yes, and that she needed him to know that she was not afraid of it. She was just asking him to know about it, to be here for it in the way he had always been there for things, which was present and reliable and entirely himself. He said he was not going anywhere. She said she knew that. He took her hand across the table and held it, and they drank their coffee in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, the east-facing window above the workbench, with the creek beyond it and the cottonwoods in their April beginning, and the sky over the flat Kansas horizon as large and open and unmarked as the first day either of them had looked at it. The third child, a boy, was born in the fall of 1887, and they named him Joseph, and he arrived into the world with the unfussy practicality of a third child, who has found that the household is already established and requires only his participation rather than his performance. He was brown-eyed and wide-awake from the first hour, and Samuel at age 7 received him with the solemn responsibility of an eldest child, and a leaner at age 4 received him with the qualified interest of a person assessing the competition, and the household rearranged itself around the new fact of him with the flexibility of a family that had been together long enough to know how. Hester recovered more slowly this time, which she accepted with the same matter-of-fact discipline she applied to things she could not change, and Levi managed the homestead through those weeks with a competence and thoroughness that was not a surprise to her but was visible to everyone else. The man who cooked the meals and managed the cattle and kept the accounts in Hester's ledger style, consulting her from the kitchen doorway, and got the children to their chores and their beds, and came in at the end of each day and sat beside her and told her what had happened and what needed attention and listened to her responses and did what she said, which was what she needed, to be in it even while she was healing, not to be set aside as a patient, but to be included as the person who knew things. By the time the November cold came in, she was fully herself again, or a new version of herself that contained everything the previous version had contained plus whatever it was that each hard thing added. And she walked the creek path on a cold November afternoon with the cottonwoods bare, and the sky that deep winter blue, and the baby on her back in a carrier that she had made from canvas and strapping in a practical design she had worked out herself, and the flat Kansas country spread out around her in its enormous, undecorated truthfulness. And she thought about the woman who had come into Caldwell 9 years ago with a leather satchel and a reputation for strangeness, and she thought about the woman walking this path now, and she thought they were the same woman, completely the same woman, only the world around her had changed, had filled up with the specific weight and warmth of people and place that constitute a life as opposed to a passage through one. She stood at the edge of the creek where it bent around a stand of roots and looked at the water, low in the November dry, running clear and cold over the flat stones, and young Joseph made a sound on her back that was contentment rather than demand, and the sky was very large and very blue, and she was exactly here, exactly herself, in the middle of everything she had built. She walked home along the familiar path with the bare cottonwoods on either side, their white trunks pale in the low afternoon sun, and came around the east side of the house to find Levi at the chopping block splitting wood for the evening fire, his coat off in the thin November warmth, the axe moving with the easy efficiency of years of practice, and Samuel beside him stacking the split pieces with the focused satisfaction of a child doing real work, and a leaner sitting on the fence watching them both and offering a running commentary that was partly instructions and partly critique and entirely a leaner. Levi saw her coming across the yard and stopped splitting and stood the axe in the block and waited, the way he had always waited, not impatiently but with that settled attentiveness that was one of the first things she had noticed about him, and that had never changed in 10 years of knowing him. She came into the yard and he looked at her and then at the baby on her back and then back at her face, and he said, "Good walk." She said it was a very good walk. He nodded and picked the axe back up and went back to the wood, because that was also one of his qualities, that he did not demand elaboration or performance, that a very good walk was sufficient, was complete, was enough. Alina said from the fence with the judicial authority of a 4-year-old who has been watching the proceedings, "Mama, I told Papa the wood should be stacked in a different order and he did not listen." Samuel said, without looking up from his stacking, "It does not need to be in a different order, Alina." Alina said, "It does though." Hester looked at the woodpile and then at Levi, who was splitting wood with his back to this debate, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was containing, with some effort, a smile. She said to Alina, "Show me why you think a different order would be better." Alina got down from the fence with the deliberate dignity of a person who has been waiting to be asked, and she began to explain her woodpile theory with a seriousness that was entirely genuine, and that Hester listened to with the same complete attention she had always given everything, because the quality of attention was not something she adjusted based on the size of the subject. And Alina felt it and stood straighter and made her case more clearly, and when she was done, she looked at her mother with bright, certain eyes. Hester said she could see the logic in it and that they should try it her way with the next load and see if it made a difference. Alina said with satisfaction, "I knew it." Samuel said he had no objection to trying it. Levi turned from the block and looked at his family, at his tall, quiet wife with their infant son on her back, at their eldest son who had his mother's precision and his father's patience, at their daughter who was going to rearrange the world around her preferred order and be largely correct about it, and at the house behind them, timber-framed and solid, and theirs, and the creek beyond it with the bare cottonwoods along its bank and the enormous Kansas sky above everything. He thought about a Thursday in April 9 years ago when he had ridden into Caldwell at the head of a tired trail crew and walked into a dry goods store for rope and lamp oil and wool socks, and found a woman behind the counter who was tall and quiet and present in a way that made the room feel different when you entered it. He thought about saying her name that first day, Hester Wallace, and meaning it, which was the only way he had ever known how to say anyone's name. He thought about the walk along the creek, and the spring evenings, and the morning in the store when he had told her he had an intention, and all of it after, the wedding and the soddy and the winter nights and the drought and the flooded root cellar and the 3 children and the ledger and the carved wood and the silver pendant and the Christmas tables and the November walk and this yard, this cold afternoon, these people. He thought it was the best sum of anything he had ever added up. He set the axe down and walked across the yard to his wife and put his arm around her and felt her lean into him in the easy, unself-conscious way of a person at home. And baby Joseph made a sound of mild interest at the change in elevation. And Alina said that she hoped they were not going to start being soft because there was still wood to stack. And Samuel told her quietly to hush. And Hester laughed, the real laugh, in the cold November air. The years continued to build on each other, the way years on a working homestead do, each one adding its layer of knowledge and change and small disasters and larger joys. Samuel grew into a young man of 17 who had his father's instinct for cattle and his mother's instinct for numbers, and who was, by general agreement of the people who knew him, one of the more quietly remarkable young men in that part of Kansas. He had his mother's height, finally, growing past Levi at 16, and he wore it the way she wore it, without apology and without performance, simply as himself. Alina, at 15, was being educated in part by a traveling teacher who came to the area 3 times a year, and in part by her mother, who had given her the run of every book she could find, and had never once told her that a subject was not for her. Alina's opinions about the organization of things had not diminished with age, and she was engaged in a correspondence with Mrs. Clara Garner's sister in Topeka about the possibility of attending the women's college there in a few years, a plan that Hester supported with complete conviction, and that Levi supported because Hester did, and because it was obviously right. Joseph, at 5, was a child of uncomplicated goodwill who followed Samuel around the homestead in the same way Samuel had once followed Levi, and who had Eleanor's brown eyes and Hester's precise, considering gaze, and who could sit quietly for longer periods than seemed possible for a 5-year-old, absorbing the world around him with a thoroughness that made Hester sometimes feel she was looking at a younger version of herself, which she found equal parts moving and amusing. In the spring of 1893, when Levi was 44 and Hester was 41, when Samuel was 12 and Eleanor was 9 and Joseph was 5, they planted a new stand of cottonwoods along the southern boundary of the property, where there was a seasonal wet draw that Hester had identified as suitable 3 years earlier. 15 young trees, planted in a line, their roots wrapped in canvas soaked in creek water, set into the prepared ground with the careful attention of people who understood they were planting something for the future rather than the present. It was a Saturday in April, and all 3 children helped, and the birdsong family came over and helped too. And by the end of the afternoon the trees were in, and the line of them was already visible across the draw, small and pale and definite, like a statement about the future of the land. Levi walked the line of new trees in the evening with Hester beside him, the 2 of them alone in the last of the April light, and she reached out and touched the pale bark of one of the young cottonwoods with the flat of her hand and thought about the trees along the creek, the original ones, the grove she had walked through on that first evening 15 years ago, leaves just coming in, pale and translucent in the evening light. Levi said, 10 years from now these will be trees. She said, 20 years from now they will be a grove. He said he expected they would still be here in 20 years to see it. She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had said her name and meant it every single time, who had built a house and a herd and a family with her, and had never once looked past her or over her or asked her to be smaller than she was, who had carved a wooden woman in her image and put it on a shelf and asked every time something hard happened if she was well and if she was glad, and she thought that 20 years was not long enough, was not anywhere near long enough. She said, Levi. He turned to look at her, and she saw in his face what she had always seen there, the same clear, direct attention, the same quality of actually looking, and she put her hand on his chest the way she had in the dry goods store all those years ago, and she said, I was called too tall and too quiet and too strange for most of my life, and you just called me by my name and you meant it. You always just meant it. Do you know what that is worth? He put his hand over hers on his chest and held it there, warm and steady, and he looked at her in the April evening with the young cottonwoods behind her and the enormous Kansas sky above everything and the first star just coming clear on the horizon, and he said, I know what you are worth. That is all I have ever known. She leaned into him and his arms came around her, and they stood there in the evening with the new trees and the old land, and the sounds of the children somewhere behind them, and the spring wind moved across the prairie in its long, sweeping way, the way it always had and always would, over this piece of earth that was theirs, over the house they had built, and the people they had become, and the life that had grown up between them like a thing planted with intention in good soil in a favorable season, tended carefully and given time and space and honesty, until it was something that would stand long after either of them could remember not having it. And in the morning the cottonwoods along the creek would catch the first light and throw it in fragments across the water, and the house would fill with the sounds of children and work and coffee and argument and laughter, and Levi Dawson would say her name across the kitchen table in the early day, Hester, the way he always said it, like it was worth saying, and she would look up from whatever she was doing and the day would begin, their day, their life on their land, under their enormous and entirely ordinary sky. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by any honest measure, everything.